Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our plenary session and extend a welcome to our plenary speaker, Professor John Ikenberry. My name is Andrew Cotty. I'm chair of the Royal Irish Academy's International Affairs Committee, and I'll be chairing this session. So I'll introduce Professor Ikenberry, although I think he and his work will probably be known to many of you. Professor Ikenberry will then speak for about 20 or 25 minutes or so, and then there will be time for questions. Professor Ikenberry is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University, where he's based in the Department of Politics and the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. Anyone, I think, who's been following academic debates on international relations for the last 20 years or so will be familiar with Professor Ikenberry's work. He's made major contributions on international order, on liberal internationalism, and on American foreign policy. His books include Liberal Leviathan, The Origins, Crisis and Transformation of the American System, and After Victory, Institutions, Strategic Restraint, and the Rebuilding of Order After Major Wars. He's author of 130 journal articles, essays, and book chapters, including in leading journals such as International Security and Foreign Affairs. Professor Ikenberry will speak to the title, Does the Liberal International Order Have a Future? And he will be drawing on his most recent book, A World Safe for Democracy, Liberal Internationalism, and the Crisis of Global Order. And again, just to remind people, if you have questions, please submit them via the Q&A function, which you'll find on the bottom of the Zoom screen. So, Professor Ikenberry, you're very welcome to our annual conference, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. It's great to be here and to be part of this extraordinary conference, which I've been watching today with great interest. And I must say that I'm humbled by the expertise I've heard today. And what I hope to do in my 25 minutes or so is to pull back and talk about the big picture, to talk about the global predicament, the problems of global governance, and to try to end at the end with an answer to the question that is the name of my lecture, which is, does the liberal international order have a future? I'm going to argue yes, but I'm going to take a trip through the valley of uncertainty and peril to get us to what I hope will be at least one argument about how we might move forward in this period of great turmoil, a kind of unquiet age that we live in. Not least because of the topic that we've all been talking about, listening to today, the global pandemic. I think I'll start with what I believe is a broad consensus view that we are witnessing a kind of unraveling or breakdown of the global liberal international order, the post-war order. It's had many names, the Pax Americana, the post-war global order, the free world. There are lots of different names. The liberal international order is the term that has been used most frequently. There's a sense that something is wrong, that something is breaking down, that we're coming to a kind of fork in the road, a kind of world historical moment. There is, broadly speaking, a kind of a global lost confidence in collective solutions to common problems. You see it globally, you see it regionally, you see it across economic, security, political, environmental domains. Basic questions are being asked by scholars and public intellectuals that we haven't seen really for a long, long time. Questions about the sources of international order. What are the basic building blocks of order? What creates stable order? Can liberal democracy make a comeback? Can capitalism and democracy, which have always been kind of odd couple twins, be brought back into balance? And then the question that I've posed to myself in my new book, and is a broad question of debate around the world, what is the future of liberal internationalism as a way of organizing the world, the cooperative organization of global order? These are all questions we're asking. And the first observation I would make is that it's not just one crisis, that we really are in a kind of perfect storm of a multiple set of transformations and breakdowns that are simultaneously making it difficult to find a center of gravity for global governance. And I would say there are three global crises unfolding simultaneously. One is what I'll call the crisis of geopolitics, which is really, as scholars of international relations, many of you study this, teach this, a global power transition is underway, led by the rise of China. The US and Europe and the Western or the, the Atlantic world is in some sense giving way to and making room, perhaps not easily, to the rise of China and more broadly the rise of the East. So a power transition, in many ways a kind of multiple layered power transition from the US to China, from a liberal democracy to a state autocracy, and from a Western centered order to an Eastern centered rising challenger. So a triple layered power transition, which the world has not seen before. And it's not just a power transition, it's a transition, as I've suggested, where basic values and orientations are on the table, struggles over, yes, rules and institutions, but over how human rights, how free information, free press, values are embedded or disembedded in international rules and institutions. So it's a fraught, profound power transition, and if it were the only crisis in front of us today, it would be serious enough. But there's a second crisis, I would say, that is roiling international order, and I'll call it the crisis of modernity. The crisis of modernity. This is really the intensification of economic security and environmental, indeed human interdependence. Modernity is something that we associate with the Industrial Revolution, the rise of science and technology, the technologies that took our societies from traditionalism to where they are today, drivers of post-Enlightenment developments that have always had a kind of double edge, a kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde reality. They bring us great advancements in learning, in technology, in communication, and transport, in medicine, and so forth, but also great dangers, which I'll talk about later on. But it's in the current guise, a kind of the arrival of the Anthropocene. Climate change, pandemics, and weapons of mass destruction, the growing capacity for violence across borders at great length. So modernity's crises. And what I would argue initially here is that this also is a world historical challenge, looking for new ways to respond to these new 21st century forms of interdependence. It would be enough if we simply tried to repair what we haven't been doing as well as we did perhaps in the earlier decades, but we have a new layer of problems that are going to require us to reinvent and extend our forms of cooperation globally. So a second crisis. And then thirdly, a crisis of liberal democracy, the weakening of the old post-war Western style forms of liberal democracy. We see it in my country, in the United States, a kind of breakdown in the old model, a breakdown of the growth coalitions that were creating a kind of center of gravity for countries in Europe and North America and East Asia, elsewhere, to drive a kind of agenda of growth-oriented transitions from older forms of of laissez-faire market society to modern social democracies, the class compromises, the pluralistic kind of norms of politics. All of this is in some sense eroding or weakening. Democracy has always been dependent on informal norms and kind of promises to behave well, and we aren't behaving very much in some of our countries. Political parties don't look as constructive as they did before. Max Weber, the great German sociologist, said that political parties are the children of democracy, and at least in my country, we have children who, in some sense, need to go to reform school. They have not been behaving as they should in a democracy as we've understood it in the past. Of course, this is generated by deeper problems of liberal democracy, rising inequality, polarization, populism, which several of your speakers have talked about today. And I would say at the deepest, most worrisome level, a kind of threatening Enlightenment values, open society, rule of law, freedom of speech, free flow of information, civil society beyond the reach of the predatory state. This is the third great crisis of world order. And together, these three crises of geopolitics, of modernity, of liberal democracy are making global governance more difficult. The demand for global governance has gone up. The supply has gone down. We are at a kind of low point. Perhaps the low point was April of 2020, a year ago, when in the worst pandemic the world has seen in 100 years and an economic crisis as bad as anything since the Great Depression, the G7 countries, the old patrons of the international order, came together and they couldn't even agree on a communique of cooperative action. It broke down on all sorts of different technicalities of hubris and studied disregard. So we have before us a set of interlocking problems that arguably are as bad, not as bad, but arguably we haven't seen anything since the 1930s and 40s, when liberal democracy at that moment really was a kind of at an extinction moment. War, depression, and fascism was putting great stress on the ability of liberal democracies and those in their world to do the work of international politics. Now, what can we say about this crisis? For me, and this is where I would say something that echoes arguments in my new book, it's important at these kind of moments to take the long view, to step back. This is what scholars are supposed to do, international relations scholars, historians, and try to make sense of the current in the larger context of the past, to look for what I would call usable history, usable knowledge from the past to help inform where we might go. And because if we do that, we see that liberal democracy and debates and struggles over international order are truly a story of struggle and conflict and repeated crises. Agonistic storyline, I think, is what you'd have to say, using that Greek word for struggle and conflict. The agonistic quality of world order across the decades and centuries. The liberal order, which I'm going to turn to now, did not begin in 1989 at the end of the Cold War. It even didn't begin in 1945. It's had a longer 200-year history, I would argue. Golden eras and crises, deep contestation, close-run things. Arthur Schlesinger wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs at the end of the 20th century, looking back over the 100 years, and said that we barely made it. Democracy was hanging really the skin of the teeth kind of moment of the 1930s. There are these kind of close run things. And indeed, from that larger perspective, 1989 and this heyday of liberal internationalism, the end of history, the post-1989 period, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, Leonard Bernstein playing Beethoven's Ode to Joy at the site of the collapse of the wall. All of that is in some sense an anomaly, a moment that is an outlier in the larger history. Indeed, I would suggest that we take some inspiration, a kind of perhaps dark inspiration from the period of the 30s and 40s. And indeed, one of the best books that I've found that has inspired my thinking is Ira Katznelson's great book, Desolation and Enlightenment, which looks at liberals, what he calls policy liberals of the 1945 period, who were forced to kind of pick up the pieces after the collapse of, almost you might say, the collapse of civilization of the 30s and 40s. Think about what that generation went through in that single mid-career lifetime. The Great Depression, of course, the rise of totalitarianism, of fascism, of total war, the Holocaust, and the dropping of the atomic bomb, all of it within a compressed period that would have suggested to almost any reasonable person that humans are not capable of sustaining organized cooperation on a global scale. And yet that generation, in a kind of world-weary way, picked up the pieces and looked for ways to find a kind of opening, a pragmatic effort to rebuild open societies in an open system, open societies in an open international system. So what I would suggest is there is a set of ideas, a history, a storyline of liberal internationalism, the cooperative organization for building and rebuilding international order, that's out there for us to reclaim. And so my book tries to do three things. It tries to convey a sense of intellectual gravitas, that liberal internationalism is a deeper, tougher, pragmatic, usable set of ideas than often are thought. It's not a precious, idealistic aspiration that we can maybe get to on a good day. Secondly, I try to be honest about what's worked and what hasn't worked, failures and accomplishments and failures. And thirdly, with an eye towards the next round of history, President Biden, I think, is definitely at the vanguard here of pushing forward. What is the agenda moving forward? And I'll say a few things about that at the end of my remarks in about 15 minutes. So what is liberal internationalism? Well, the title, of course, you may recall, is taken from what many people believe to be the single one-sentence version of what liberal internationalism is. That's Wilson's phrase, to make the world safe for democracy. And that phrase has often been understood and passed down through the last 100 years as a phrase that liberal internationalism is a idealistic crusade to make the world into the image of Western democracy. And I take issue with that. I argue that the liberal international vision, which began 100 years before Wilson and has been unfolding 100 years after Wilson, really is better described as the phrase better captures the inspiration as an effort to create a world that will make liberal democracies such as they are safe and secure. That is to say, it's building a kind of environment for an ecosystem, a geopolitical space, so that liberal democracies can do their thing, can achieve what they are attempting to achieve, to protect their institutions, to make the advancements they have built into their DNA, to manage their mutual vulnerabilities, to create a framework, and this is important, for balancing the values and conflicts that are at the heart of liberal democracy. Think about what the values that you try to encapsulate in liberal democracy: liberty and equality, deeply and in tension with each other. individualism and community, sovereignty and interdependence. It's a recipe for constant disappointment and controversy. There is no equilibrium point in liberal democracy. You're constantly having to rethink, reinvent, rebalance. And finally, the liberal democratic project is a project in dealing with what I would argue is the deepest challenge, which is managing our mutual interdependence. So if you think of liberal internationalism, there are four convictions. Number one, that trade and exchange properly managed is good for all of us. Secondly, that rules and institutions facilitate cooperation. Thirdly, that democracies have shared values and capacities to cooperate in unusual ways. Yes, you can cooperate and you need to cooperate with all kinds of states, but liberal democracies do have a kind of hidden capacity to work with each other that is important to exploit. And thirdly, under conditions of rising economic and security and environmental interdependence, we are better off cooperating than non-cooperating. Ben Franklin, one of my heroes, the founding father, on July 4th, 1776, looked at his fellow delegates from the 13 colonies and he said, we are going to need to hang together or surely we will hang separately. And that is the motto, I think, of the liberal democratic project and these four convictions that have been traveling across 200 years. Now, obviously, the liberal international order is troubled. And here I want to turn to the contemporary problems. I would say there are three you might say disasters or problems that have inflicted damage on liberal internationalists of goodwill in Europe, the United States, East Asia, and around the world. One is, and this is now, I'm speaking primarily as an American here, looking at the liberal international project in the hands of America. The Iraq War is number one, which truly did discredit you might call conservative, certainly Republican internationalists, and the more broadly conceived liberal project. Now, at a different moment, I would defend that the liberal internationalist imagination was not behind the Iraq War. It was a realist project of one kind or another. Richard Cheney and Rumsfeld were not liberal internationalists, but Iraq War told us something, that certainly the American-led liberal order was not what we hoped it would be. The 2008 financial crisis, which started in America, revealed a kind of liberal internationalism for the few, a sense that liberal international order is more about a platform for capitalists and bankers to do deals. And then thirdly, you might call it the liberal bet that China would, by joining the WTO and being welcomed into this liberal order, would make transitions, as we saw in Korea, in Taiwan, in Singapore, in Thailand, in Indonesia, in countries in Southern Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, would make transitions as trade-oriented states opportunistically gaining from participation in liberal order, would have it rebound to reforms that would make them less autocratic, less state socialist, and the opposite has occurred. And so liberal order, as it was conceived after the Cold War, looks like we didn't know what we were doing. We were naive. We thought we would bring China in, but we did indeed do that. But as some people are critiquing the liberal order, look what you did. You created a monster. Now you are at its peril. I would say just a few things before I say what went wrong. And here I would just say that when if you are of the view that we want to at least conceive of a pathway into the future that would mean rebuilding liberal order, open, rule-based, cooperative order, anchored in liberal democracies, we need to, in some sense, reclaim the past, defend liberal order from those who see it as simply imperialism or a source of injustice. It can certainly be seen in those ways, but we should try to show that that the glass is at least half empty, if not more so. That under the auspices of this liberal order over the last 70 years, many things that we take for granted have been accomplished. And let me give you my super six, things that we've done under the auspices of liberal international order. One is that we've reopened the world economy after World War II and ushered in a golden era of growth that lifted more people out of poverty than any other era in world history. Secondly, we created a framework for the reintegration of Germany and Japan, who had been fascist or imperial enemies, and in a matter of years were the second and third largest capitalist economies in the world and partners in the larger project. Thirdly, Germany and France buried centuries of animosity, of enmity, and were able to find a way to rebuild Europe and launch the European project. Fourthly, the so-called G7 countries created unprecedented forms of multilateral intergovernmental cooperation to manage their interdependence. The IMF, the World Bank, the WTO out of GATT, the WHO, obviously the United Nations, the umbrella of security institutions. 5, each of these countries that came out of World War II in its own way made a transition that we take for granted. And that is the transition from a kind of 19th century liberal, laissez-faire market economy to modern social democracies. Germany, the market society, a kind of conservative version in France, in Britain, in each of our countries, the United States, the New Deal and the post-New Deal. And then finally, 6, in the more recent period, you have a new cohorts of countries that have made transitions to liberal democracies and wanted to find a kind of order to join, a club that they could call their own, that they could become members and gain from. Whether it's Eastern European countries after the end of the Cold War, we call it NATO enlargement, or we call it the enlargement of the EU, whether it's the larger set of multilateral institutions that were easy to join. Think of South Korea, where I go every year for 25 years as a global scholar at a university, and many other things I do in East Asia, in Japan, in China. But in South Korea, it's the most interesting country in the world in many ways, as it's made this transition from military authoritarianism to democracy, a thriving multi-party system, to an outward-oriented country in trade and development. And now the first country that was a recipient of ODA, now a patron of ODA, and a kind of bridge between Asia and the West, between the North and the South. That could have only happened, South Korea, in the context of a order that we just kind of can, if you are of one persuasion or the other, throw away because, well, it's not working anymore. Now we're in the era of great power competition, everybody for himself. So let me end by just saying what went wrong and what can go right in the future. Well, what went wrong is I've already hinted at with Iraq, with 2008, with China. But I think a deeper kind of problem was that when the end of the Cold War occurred, the liberal order, which was a partial order, was an order inside of a bipolar system after World War II up until 1989, that inside order became the outside order. The inside order became the outside order. And that was partly because there was no other order on offer. Russia was enfeebled. China had yet to make its great multi-decade double-digit growth trajectory. And the only order, the only framework, the platform for organizing cooperation was this inside order, now the outside order. And why wouldn't you want to join it? It looked incredibly successful. Modernity had spoken, history had spoken. Liberal democracies have won the wars of the 20th century against fascism, totalitarianism, Soviet communism. So there was a kind of sense that let's make it global. But in making it global, some of the ingredients of success were lost. And this is what I'll just say very quickly. There was always a kind of club quality to liberal order. That to be inside was to gain certain advantages of membership, like a mutual aid society. And here's the important point. There was a logic of conditionality. A logic of conditionality. To be inside of that order was to buy into a suite of obligations. Yes, you'd get rights. Yes, you'd get access to other countries. Yes, you'd get security. Yes, you'd get trade mechanisms for managing interdependence. But you'd kind of have to be part of a coalition, of a club. And with the end of the Cold War, that club lost its way, and it became less of a club and what I call in the book a shopping mall. The club became a shopping mall where countries could come in and get what they wanted and leave when they wanted, or narrowly get trade benefits without buying into human rights. And that's, of course, what China did. The logic of conditionality. Yes, China, you're invited in, but we expect certain things in return. Logic of conditionality. The EU is struggling with, it's at the heart of the EU as well. And so it's there with how the EU thinks about Hungary or Poland. So the logic of conditionality, that's the secret of the period we've just lived through, and we've lost it. Now, this leads me to the last final moments of my talk. And I'll just say that, what does this mean for the future? And I have been incredibly heartened by President Biden. I think he is all in for one last effort to see if this world that we've lived through can be extended into the future through reimagination and reform and rebuilding of coalitions. It's not going to be an American-led order as in the past, but it's going to have to be built around coalitions that I hope the United States can help lead, because I do think there's a bigger role for middle powers, for non-Western powers, a so-called D10, high capacity democracies. But in some sense, rebuilding that coalition, that club of like-minded states, and that's at the heart, I think, of what Biden is trying to do. Number two, I think that the liberal order has got to be seen as not simply a campaign to globalize the world. Liberal internationalism as a kind of toolkit for global order, as a kind of roadmap for global order, has always been about, and this is what I said repeatedly in my talk today, managing complex interdependence, which is growing and will be greater in the future than in the past. And then thirdly, a kind of humility, a kind of pragmatic retreat to some extent from the high water marks of the kind of sense of possibility of the post-Cold War period. We can do great things together, but we need to be humble about what we can't do, and to concentrate on priorities. We can't do everything, but we need to focus on the priorities and build from a kind of coalition that can be expanded outward. So I would say, I want to end on Andrew, I want to end on an optimistic note. I'm the last speaker in this long conference, so I know that everybody is tired, perhaps, maybe a little depressed. So what gives me some confidence? Here are what I would say are my reasons for confidence. One is, again, very American. Number one, Trump has shown us the alternative, and it's not pretty. We've looked over the cliff and we've seen the abyss, and we don't want to go back. Secondly, Biden gets it. It's remarkable, an old white guy at the dusk of his career, looking back and learning lessons with lots of bruises and missteps, remembering from his generation what can be done for the next generation. He's a bridge to the next generation. Thirdly, the problems of modernity are growing. And so we're going to need to do something like Benjamin Franklin said: artificial intelligence, cyber, quantum computing, bioengineering, not to speak of climate, which is a change in global warming, global heating, which is happening sooner than we thought, and of course pandemics, which are not a once in 100-year phenomenon, but as our epidemiologists are telling us, variants could be with us forever on an ongoing basis. That's number three. Four, China has shown us that there is a rival modernity on tap. China is increasingly out there saying, are you tired of the Western liberal approach? We've got something that might be better. We think it's better. It's capitalism without liberalism, and it's capitalism without democracy, a kind of creeping totalitarianism based on big data and surveillance technology. And I think it has its limits. I don't think it's going to work, but it's out there, and it is raising the stakes and forcing us to be better at what we do if we think we want to protect our values for our grandchildren to survive the 21st century. And then finally, democracies do have unique, distinctive characteristics. We do have a different view about human rights. We do, we're truly, we shed a tear when we look at the young people in Hong Kong. We do have different views about environment, about worker rights, about protection of speech and information. So there is an agenda there. We are at a perfect storm, I'll just say in conclusion. But crises, as the old Chinese saying is, be careful what you wish for, but there's also the one that crises are always opportunities as well. And so there really is an opportunity to reimagine our future, to take from the past what worked, to learn from what didn't, and to stride boldly into the future, thinking that we still have a chance to make the world better, and and to do that, we've got to do it together. Andrew?
Thank you so much, John. That was great. And there's an awful lot to think about, but also it's nice to hear some optimism as well when academics are sometimes professional pessimists, I think. We've a few questions, so just to remind listeners that you can send in your questions by the question and answer function, which is on the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll maybe start with a question from Paul Gillespie, and he refers to some work which I think, John, you'll probably be familiar with. He says that Haas and Kupchan argue that the US-centered alliances are a club of democracies poorly suited to foster cooperation across ideological lines. They call for a global concert of powers as a steering group instead. What do you think of their argument?
I don't think much of it. Charlie Kupchan is one of my oldest friends, and I just don't buy it. I'm not sure he buys it when he looks at it. But let's start with what we might agree upon, which is the global governance mechanisms are broken, and there is a need for what we'll call the leading states of the system to work together. We can do multiple things. We're going to need to do multiple things in the realm of global governance. We have something called the United Nations Security Council. Ireland is now a member in this cycle. And if I would urge Richard Haass and Charlie Kupchan to rewrite their article and call for a effort to reform the membership of the Security Council, to call on China if it really wants to have a club of great powers, a new concert of Europe where China would be on a kind of moral level playing field and Putin's Russia would be on the same moral playing field as the United States and these other great powers, then let's do it in the United Nations where we have a mechanism. If you were to step outside of the UN and build a layer, a kind of Vienna settlement concert on top of that, you are going to further erode the legitimacy of the United Nations, which countries that aren't great powers rely upon. Non-Western countries, post-colonial countries, Asian countries, African countries. The UN is what you have, the General Assembly, but also the Security Council. So we have the 2005 expert panel report on different options for reforming the United Nations, and I'm all for it. And by the way, the United States is not the stumbling block. It's China. China doesn't want Japan and India in its club of the UN Security Council. Let's put their feet to the fire. What would the Kupchan-Haass proposal do? It would, and this is my second line of critique, it would provide tacit legitimacy for Russia's move in Ukraine and China's behavior in Hong Kong, in Western China with the Uyghurs, and its aggressive moves in the South China Sea, and its intimidation of Taiwan through a military buildup. The Kupchan-Haass proposal would, in effect, and they'll deny this, but it's there, it would give a kind of global imprimatur to their 19th century sphere of influence agendas of regional hegemony. That's what we don't want. You are ceding to them something they dearly want. Thirdly, you are raising the white flag of defeat, where we are at a moment where the liberal democracies and liberal democracy itself is at a kind of low tide. That's what I said in my remarks. And so at your low tide, do you signal to your rivals, China and Russia, who dearly want for liberal democracy to fail, for the European Union to fail, for the Atlantic NATO to fail, for the free world coalition to fail? Do you at that moment of low tide raise the white flag and say, okay, we can't do it anymore. We need you to be part of a realist, great power 19th century club where you get to do what you want in your sphere and we'll try to repair damage in our sphere. That's not a world I want to be part of. So I think it's not only wrong, I think it's dangerous. And I think even, and this is my last comment, both of my dear friends, Haass and Kupchan, are channeling Henry Kissinger, who wrote his doctoral dissertation on the concert of Europe, the Vienna settlement, brilliant book. But even Henry Kissinger would look at the Haass-Kupchan as a hardline realist, look at their proposal and say, no way, there's no way America can live in a world defined simply by realpolitik. Indeed, remember Kissinger's major argument in his seminal book, Diplomacy, when he says, the United States, for better or worse, is a liberal democracy and it sees the world through a liberal democratic lens, as does much of the rest of the world. And if I'm right, the world still wants that as a kind of nucleus for a larger world that includes the non-democracies. So it's not in the American DNA to live in a world defined by, at the highest level, by a sphere of influence, realpolitik, 19th century retrograde great power club. Not
Right.
to put too fine a point on it.
Great, thank you very much. We've two, I think, interrelated questions on the economic aspects of this. So Padraig Harmody says, you highlighted the impacts of inequality. Can liberal internationalism be social democratized? And if so, what would be the best ways of doing that? And I'll maybe put that together with a second question, which is a little different, but maybe along the same theme, which says that in a sense, you've put together liberal democracy and capitalism in your thinking. But the question from Su Ming Q is, could something else go with democracy as the basis of a global order? Socialism would have different interpretations of elements of liberalism that you've enumerated on trade, rules, shared values. Could socialism go with democracy on a world scale?
Well, that's a great question. They are two slightly different points, and let me just start with the first one, which is kind of more of a, you might say, a political economy type of question. I do think that one of the takeaways from my diagnosis, and I think it's shared with many other critical thinkers on liberal democracy and liberal internationalism, is that the neoliberal turn in the 80s and onward did do damage to the post-war social democratic compromise that underlay the system, what John Ruggie, the Harvard scholar, calls embedded liberalism. We had openness, but we also had social democratic mechanisms and government capacities to soften openness, to sustain social safety nets, to worker retraining, unemployment benefits, trade dispute mechanisms that allow countries that are in danger of losing sectors to slowly transition. So you get the benefits of an open system, but you have economic security underlying these open societies. That got lost in the 80s and 90s as more and more of our middle class and working populations have seen greater insecurity and seen that their children are not going to get what they had in terms of economic benefits and rising income standards. And so if the liberal international order is to have another cycle of history, another future moment, I do think all of our countries have to, in some sense, reinvent social democracy. I think what Biden is trying to do is tie that to climate change and the Green New Deal, and to new technologies, new jobs go together, solar panels, electrical power cars, a kind of new technology. We've seen this before. There are kind of momentary declines in employment in particular sectors, but there are new sectors that come up. So this kind of harnessing the transition to clean energy, to new economic opportunities with new technologies, building and creating new sectors and work opportunities. That's the bet that Biden is making. I think other leaders around the capitalist democratic world are also making similar bets, and that's critical. And I would associate myself with that agenda. Now, democracy and socialism. Then the question is, what is socialism? I don't think it's what you see in China, which is not. Social democracy is based on a kind of sort of rights framework that you trace back to Locke and to the liberal tradition, the pre-liberal democratic tradition, where governments are in some sense traceable to their authority, traceable to the people, for the people, by the people, and so forth. And so social democracy continues that tradition of building capacities, government capacities to provide for the public good. That we've gone through centuries and cycles of this, the progressive period, the New Deal, the Great Society. Each of our countries has those moments, but I don't think there's a kind of dividing line where independent judiciary, an independent press, rights of citizens and votes that are based on free and fair elections of multi-parties, that has to be part of the framework and the foundation. But with that, you can tilt as far to the left as you can go. And indeed, in some very interesting research by a colleague of mine in Singapore National University, a kind of global survey of what is kind of the median voter ideology of government. It's a kind of Keynesian social democracy. The US is kind of an outlier to the right. Some countries are outliers to the left, but a kind of center of gravity is a kind of mixed economy, mixed government, social democratic order that gets the benefits of capitalism, but that protects people, but also protects basic rights. And so I think that's where the center of gravity is, and we should wish that particular synthesis well going forward.
Thank you, John. We've a question also on American power, and of course you've written extensively on the relationship between American power and international order. Peter Gunning asks, what would be the place and role of Western military and predominantly American power in an adapted and renewed liberal international order?
That's a great question from Mr. Gunning. Well, I'll give you my view. The Ikenberry view is that the American-led security order is a progressive development in world politics. Full stop. I'll defend that proposition today. That it is, in world historical terms, it's really quite remarkable that you have this extended security system that survived 75 years in NATO, in Europe, these various alliance parties in East Asia. The U.S. has about 55 alliance parties of various sorts. Some of them are not Article 5 treaties, but together it's been very helpful as a kind of underlying source of stability for building order among the democracies and providing a kind of stable framework for countries that are outside of that order to make decisions about how they want to interact with that order. There's a new book I've just read from a Johns Hopkins political scientist called Armed Guess. It's a quite evocative title, Armed Guess. And it basically is about this permanent system of bases where the US has plopped down in a kind of agreed upon way in various countries, not least, most importantly in East Asia, Japan and South Korea. And it's a kind of bizarre political order, but it has a kind of dynamic, constructive quality to it. And this is where, if you want to read my high theory argument for this, you would go back and read my book After Victory, but it binds the United States to Europe and Asia. It creates mechanisms, what I call voice opportunities for alliance partners to have ready access to America. It creates a kind of framework for we'll call it political externalities, so that you can do business between each other more easily, even though the basic framework is tied to security. NATO is not just about defense. It's about protecting our larger assets, what Francis Bacon called the human estate. It's about creating ongoing relationships, working relationships, voice opportunities for reciprocally oriented problem solving. So I would hate to live in a world where it's gone. Now, I think you could live in a world and still have liberal order without it. But I think looking into the future with China as it is, you want more of it rather than less of it. And I'll just end on this note. Some of my friends who are friendly rivals on the, we'll call it the realist side. Patrick Porter, John Mearsheimer, Steve Walt. These are kind of realists who after the Cold War ended, they turned their realism on liberalism and started making arguments that liberal states get America into trouble. Liberalism is bad. It got us into Iraq. So they've been making these arguments for the last 20 years or so. And they offer a view of what they call offshore balancing, retrenchment, and restraint. Those are the three terms they use. But even they look at China and they say, well, maybe it's too soon to wind up the alliance system. Maybe we should keep the alliance system a few more years. So even they, I think of Patrick Porter, he's more hawkish on China than I am. And I would not be surprised if in a few years, he's an even stronger supporter of liberal order than I am. So I do think the alliance system is a kind of brilliant accident that has had, as I said, externalities that we want to protect for liberal order purposes.
Thank you. You mentioned China a bit there, and you spoke a bit about China in your talk. I suppose one of the big questions today is, where does the appropriate balance lie between, on the one hand, countering perhaps China and Chinese ambitions and Chinese power, and on the other hand, cooperating with China where that may perhaps be necessary? So what would your views be about how we, and I guess broadly this might be the West, should deal with China in today and in coming decades?
Yeah, I'll start with what would ordinarily be my final point in the answer, and that is we do need China and they need us for solving 21st century problems of modernity. The global climate crisis cannot be solved unless we work together. Pandemic, obviously China, we want China to have better protocols in terms of handling public health at home, because we are victims of their own domestic practices, and we want transparency and best practices across the board, modeled for the world by WHO experts, based on enlightened expertise in science, unadulterated by power politics. So we need China to be at its best, even if it doesn't buy into everything that we buy into. So that would be my final point. But let's start with the other point, and that is that I think it is a balancing act, because I do think that there is a Chinese challenge that some of us on the liberal international side did not fully appreciate 20 years ago, because it wasn't there 20 years ago. And we did see China as a potential stakeholder. And in various ways, it's not entirely a revisionist state. But at the deepest level, it does not want the things that we want to survive in the world. So there is a kind of rivalry there that's deep, that's anchored in what the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas calls modernity projects. I think that a kind of revitalization of the liberal democratic world is actually necessary, because we want to protect what we care about. That's what I've been describing as in my lecture, what we might call our social purposes: human rights, freedom of speech, independent judiciary, all the things that we associate with Western liberal democracy. But in creating that kind of rejuvenated coalition of like-minded states, it actually puts us in a better position to constructively engage China. If we're all going it alone, if Europe is cutting deals with China and undercutting America, and if America is cutting deals with China and undercutting Europe, we are all worse off. And China will exploit that. And indeed, a China that sees a kind of not aggressive, but consolidated, open, multilateral, progressive-oriented coalition of liberal democracies that stretches from Seoul to Delhi in the East and all the way through the West, they might not like it, but it will be a better, more constructive aggregation of states to do the business of solving the problems of modernity. So it's both good for us and it's good for them in the long term. And just one final point, it's good for the United States domestically because, interestingly, and this is more of an IR theory point, every global great power that the United States has come up against in its 200 years has always been less liberal than America. Let's leave aside Great Britain and the original War of Independence in 1812, but the US is kind of what's called the first in freedom. Every country, starting with autocratic Germany in World War I, obviously Germany and Japan in World War II, and the Soviet Union, in every case, the US was up against a less liberal, indeed non-liberal, anti-liberal, either fascist or imperial or totalitarian state. And that kind of great power rivalry, the US against its ideological other, in some sense created ideas and aspirations in America to be a better, more liberal America. So World War I led to a progressive movement and the franchise extended to women, and all sorts of progressive legislation to make American society better. The New Deal got connected to World War II, and we have the post-war innovations, the Great Society. The Soviet Union was offering a different view of the future, a workers' paradise under communism, and it made America self-conscious about its race problems. And so the civil rights legislation of 1964 and 5, the Great Immigration Act of 1965, which led to non-European immigration and changed the face of America, occurred during the Cold War when the United States was trying to present to the world a better image of itself, a multicultural America. And that was the geopolitical contest that had, ironically, progressive, liberal, enhancing effects at home. And in a strange way, the coming rivalry with China, I hope, will do the same thing. It makes us more embarrassed by our shortcomings, and it can incentivize us to do better on the domestic side. So I kind of welcome a healthy, constructive competition with China.
Great, thank you very much, Sean. Well, we've come to the end of our time. There are actually more questions, and I'm sure we'd be interested to hear your answers for a good few minutes more. But we have unfortunately come to the end of our time. So I'd just like to thank you so much for your fascinating lecture and the insights, and also for, as you put it, the optimism in terms of looking at the state of world politics and where we can look perhaps for sources of optimism, especially perhaps given the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic as well. So thank you so much, and thank you on behalf of the audience. Now I will just turn to close our conference and make a few closing remarks. So firstly, I'd just like to thank all of our speakers and our audience today. So thank you to our speakers and paper givers for their contributions. Thank you to our audience for staying with us, and also for all of your questions. I'd also perhaps just like to go back to this morning and thank Foreign Minister Simon Coveney for opening the conference and for his willingness to take questions as well. Also, on behalf of the Royal Irish Academy, I'd just like to reiterate our thanks to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been a very long-standing supporter of this conference, and the Academy greatly appreciates that. In normal times, there would be a reception this evening in the Department of Foreign Affairs headquarters, Ivy House, to launch the latest issue of the journal Irish Studies in International Affairs. Unfortunately, of course, we can't have that reception, but hopefully in a year's time, we may be in a position to welcome people back to the Academy in person, and also to a similar reception. Also, just to note that the Standing Committee on International Affairs of the Academy, which organises this conference, also manages the Academy's prestigious journal, Irish Studies in International Affairs. So just to remind our paper givers that papers from the conference are normally submitted to Irish Studies in International Affairs, and the deadline for submissions will be Friday, the 18th of June, and the editors will be in contact with the paper givers in relation to that, and also to other members of our audience. If anyone else is looking for outlets for academic publication, we encourage people to consider Irish Studies in International Affairs. Finally, then, I would just like to say a few words of thanks to the people who've made this conference possible. Firstly, my colleagues on the working group from the Standing Committee on International Affairs who've worked on putting the conference programme together, Etain Tanham, Colin Raptor, and Padraig Carmody. And finally, in particular, I would like to thank the Academy's administrative staff, Pauline McNamara and Sharon O'Connor, who've put in an awful lot of work to make this conference happen. And I know that we've all learned a great deal in the last year or so in terms of delivering these kinds of events online. So I'd particularly like to thank Pauline and Sharon for all their work in putting the conference together and ensuring that the conference has gone so smoothly. Your work is greatly appreciated, and thank you very much. So with that, I will close the conference and wish everyone a very enjoyable rest of your day. Thank you.